Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. And today, we're being joined by Charles Thomas, author of The Disappearing. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we are thrilled to have you. Are you ready to begin?
I am.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
I think my best advice for someone currently writing a book is to keep an open mind about alternatives. And what I mean by alternatives is that you're going to have a lot of choices to make in your writing career, even if it's your first book or your 50th book. I'll give you some examples. For me, I used to be very opposed to outlining all my stories because I'm also a screenwriter in the film industry, TV and film. And I was opposed to outlining because my hero, Stephen King, he doesn't outline. I don't have to outline. At some point, so my wife always reads my stuff first, right? And the story I always like to tell is like she'll give me notes and say, this works, this doesn't work. And then at some point, I gave her one of my stories, and she was like, yeah, this is just terrible. So I said, okay, if she hates it, maybe I'll go back and try and outline. So the next thing I did, the next script I wrote, I outlined heavily. And I haven't looked back. And I was so opposed to it before, and now I can't live without it. So that's an example of something that maybe you're not big on, that you should go back and think about. Maybe I can try and outline, or maybe if you heavily outline and you're stuck on something, maybe don't outline. And another example of this is that The Disappearing that just came out, I basically just put it out because of everything that's going on right now. I wanted people to have something to read, so I put it out for free over at Smashwords. My first book, Brine, was published through Crossroad Press. So I wasn't intending for these books to, one, be published by a house and another to be self-published, but the situation just came up, and I said, well, I like to keep my alternatives open, so here we go. So that would be my advice, is just don't be so stuck on something that it stops you in your tracks from finishing your book.
Absolutely. And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Well, I want to say finding a publisher, but that honestly just kind of fell into my lap, is that the owner of Crossroad Press and I were Twitter friends, which is so random, but he was one of the first people I followed on Twitter and vice versa. And then like 10 years later, he starts this, he had started the press along the way, but 10 years later I said, hey, I've got this book. Again, I'm in film and TV. So I said, David, I don't know what to do with this. Like, I live in film world. I've got this book. And he said, I run a press, right? And I went, oh, okay, that's right. So that was, I say easy. It was relatively simple in the way it happened. But when I then wrote Disappearing, which was based off an old script, his house, his editors and stuff said, this isn't really a fit for Crossroad Press. It's not exactly what we do. So when I handed it over, I just figured, well, they're going to print it because I'm a genius, so here we go. And they said, well, this isn't really fit for us, which a publisher, that happens, You wouldn't give, for example, a non-fiction book to a sci-fi publishing house. It just doesn't make sense. So each place has their own criteria of what they're looking for, and it's not just genre; it's very specific things. So pay attention to that. That's a little difficult to. You think your world is set once you find that publisher, but it's not. It's just not the case. So you got to keep your eyes peeled on what exactly they're picking up, and make sure either you're writing that stuff, or if you're not writing that stuff, look elsewhere.
Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launches that has worked well?
Sure. So Crossroad Press, one of the things is that they like to have an audio book version, which I was not expecting when they picked it up. And luckily for me, I've been doing a podcast for 6 years now this May. So I'm used to having my voice out there, and I've got my sort of radio voice, I guess, a little bit. So I've been able to do that easily. I was able to read the whole thing, no problem. It's not the same for other authors, of course, but I do think that it's very helpful for authors to learn how to read their own stuff, because every piece of dialogue that comes across, every description, inflections that other people just will not know. So you're going to listen back to it, someone else reads it, and you're like, well, I didn't mean it exactly like that. When you read it, it will be exactly like you want it to be, So if your publisher wants you to do an audiobook, that's great, and I say jump on it. And I've actually sold more copies of the audio version than the physical copy of the book. So it worked out.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of audiobooks myself. In fact, with my books, just about every single one of them, I recorded them myself. Now, currently with my time crunch, it's not as easy to do. So the last couple I have had outsourced, but actually going through it and recording it yourself for the first time is beyond brutal. And then after that, it does get easier and easier. And it's a great method to give your book one final proofread, because no one ever catches every mistake. It's just not possible. Mm-hmm. So it's just such a great method to be able to find those final little errors by speaking it out.
Yep. And people like to drive and listen to podcasts or audiobooks, and well, you're missing out on a whole new market there if you're not doing it.
Exactly. Well, speaking of books, I'd like to know what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
I would love to say some like War and Peace or something super intellectual, but the book I read the most as a kid, and I actually read it earlier this week, was Glory Lane by Alan Dean Foster. It's this outer space tale where these kids from the 80s, it's a 1980s book, they just go out into outer space, and one's like this punk, and one's a yuppie, and one's this ditzy girl, and they have to save the universe. It's super silly and corny. It's a very fast read, but there's something to be found and learned in every book, I think. And so, having just read this past week, again for the first time in a few years, that every character is very distinct. Like, you know exactly who is talking. When somebody says a line of dialogue, it makes sense for that character, and it can't come out of anybody else's mouth. And this is true for there's tons of side characters, because they go out in outer space. So of course you've got that whole discovery phase where, like, wow, look at all these alien races. Well, those characters, those alien characters, all have to be distinct as well, and they are. They all speak differently, they all act differently, and that when you have a lot of characters, it's very tough to do, especially if you have like a series of books, or maybe you've been writing for a while, and maybe characters start blending in together, and you're thinking, like, how do I separate these? It's just, you got to find a way that when someone's reading the script or book, what does it matter what they're reading, that every character is distinct in their way they're speaking and the way they're acting, and it doesn't betray their character. And I think Glory Lane does that very well. As goofy and silly as it is, I think it holds up. Even, the ending's a little rushed, but I still had fun reading it again.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
So Orson Welles has one. It might sound a little dark, I guess, for this podcast, but I'm going to go with it. It's, "We're born alone, we live alone, we die alone. Only through our love and friendship can we create the illusion for the moment that we're not alone." And the reason I like that quote is that that's kind of what we're doing as creators, whether you're writing fiction, nonfiction, or you work in film and TV, any sort of entertainment, you're helping to create that illusion that we're not alone in the world, that people can be connected. And especially right now, everybody's separated, social distancing and politics, etc. It seems like people are the most divided. It is through art and writing and singing or whatever it is that people come together. And maybe it is an illusion, like Orson says, but it's a necessary one. And I don't want to say we're the most important people in the world, but there you are.
Well, Charles, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
My personal website is atlantascreenwriter.com. You can find my film and TV stuff, plus links to my books. There's atlantafilmchat.com, which is my podcast about the Atlanta/Georgia film scene. And my production company is hootyhooproductions.com.
Well, Charles, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how to get your book published with a proven system that works, grab a free copy of my book at getpublishedpodcast.com.